John, could you tell me how you started as an actor and ended up being what you are now?
Sure. So I came to New York City, right behind me here, as I talk with Danny, in 1992, and I was a professional actor for about 15 years, and by professional I mean I was on Broadway, off Broadway, had a lot of speaking roles in TV and film, and was in all the unions and stuff. And what happened was, is I'm a dad, and my kids got to an age where I realized I'd have to start traveling extensively for long periods of time, meaning more than like 1 or 2 weeks at a time, and I decided I don't want to do that. And also acting, what people don't realize about being a professional actor is most of your work, your day job, is actually auditioning, and it's fun, but it's exhausting. And I had a really good time in my 20s, but I was like, okay, I need something new. And fortunately, I fell into social media. At the time, it was called new media, back in the day, and I fell in love with podcasting because my dad raised me on old record player versions of radio dramas, so like The Shadow, and I fell in love with that medium of sound. And I realized pretty quickly that podcasting and social media, then new media, was going to be a way to give people a voice, literally, in terms of helping define their brand or tell stories. And then that led me to become the vice president of business development for a company called Blog Talk Radio, where I worked for a few years helping people create podcasts, both individuals and businesses. And I'd always had kind of a knack for introducing people and networking, so that was good in terms of business development. It was also at that time, about 5 blocks from here, that I ran a big pod camp, which is a bar camp, which is sort of a casual way to run an event. People sign up on a wiki to speak, and about 950 people came. I led a lot of volunteers, so I've led a lot of events. And after Blog Talk Radio, I got into PR, where I was very blessed to meet one of my long-time best friends, Danny DeVriend, and at Porter Novelli. And I worked here in the city at Porter for a couple of years, learned a ton of great stuff, and I went from being a VP to an EVP, which, you know, in PR you got to take that with a grain of salt. Titles are important, but, you know, I think what happened too is I was very lucky from a timing standpoint. When I got into social media at the time, a lot of people literally didn't even know what Twitter was, let alone how to use it. So I was lucky timing-wise. And I learned a lot from brands from kind of the corporate world. Then on a personal level, my father passed away about 7 years ago, just last week actually, and he was a psychiatrist. And I realized I had learned a lot of great lessons up to that point to really want to create a nonprofit. And I ran a nonprofit organization called the Hapathon Project for a couple of years. That's also where I started writing more for Mashable, The Guardian, HuffPo, Slate, other places, and wrote my first of 2 books for Penguin called Hacking Happiness, which has led me to my present work, really focused on the intersection of well-being, human well-being, and technology. And by well-being, I don't just mean mood or physiological well-being, say like mental health. I also mean economic well-being. We're at a very important time in our history as humans to sort of really understand what the values are that we want to imbue into the machines that we build. And I should point out, I was working on my last book called Artificial Intelligence, about looking for a code of ethics for AI. When I spoke at South by Southwest either 3 or 4 years ago as a guest of IEEE, it's the world's largest technology association, mainly focused on engineers. And I spoke about the need for a code of ethics for AI. And fortunately, there were 2 people from the board of directors or senior leadership who liked what I said, and I went in and pitched IEEE and said, look, you guys are kind of like the United Nations of tech. You should build a code of ethics for AI. And fortunately, there was some wonderful people in leadership there who had already been thinking about something along those lines, and they liked the idea. And now for the past 2 years, I'm executive director of a program for IEEE focused, not necessarily just on ethics, because that word sometimes people think of compliance, which is sort of legal ethics, which is incredibly important. But we're more focused on what is often called values-based design, which is using applied ethics as a new type of due diligence to really ask my end users, my stakeholders, my customers, or citizens, what are their values, and how can we examine them, not just in light of sort of discerning what they may be, but discerning what they may be in light of how now humans are dealing directly with autonomous and intelligent systems and the specific issues they bring up. So that's my journey from 1992 to now in 2018.
And one of the things when we look at your journey, John, is that you seem to be ahead of the curve like every single time. You were into radio podcasting now is big. It's doing its big entry, but you were doing that ages ago. As you said, you went into social media just before the curve. You went into well-being and ethical just before the curve as well, because it's now becoming a very big trend, and a lot of big companies are now turning slowly in that direction. Why is that? What's your ability to just look behind that corner and say that's a big thing, that's why I want to invest myself in?
I don't know. I don't really call myself a trendsetter. I try to ever avoid the term futurist. Not that it's a bad term, but I forget. There's different people that use this term, but like a presentist or is a lot of times what I'll do is I'll say, well, what are a number of trends happening in the present that seem to have a convergence along with what I think might be a real need, and then see are there trends in how those needs are looking to be filled. And then usually what happens is I think what I tend to be speculating on is how those things connect. And I know sometimes people have said of work I've done that I'm conflating things, and I get confused sometimes, meaning conflating to me usually has a pejorative sound to it, like you're kind of confusing, this and this don't really match. And my point a lot of times is, no, this is where I see these things intersecting. And I think that's where I've been fortunate, just because it helps if you are thinking ahead. And then if you have hopefully insights based on research or something that can help people, where I've been ahead of stuff. And I know that Danny knows this, but when we worked together, I always talked about augmented reality, and now that's also, that and virtual reality are kind of in the next couple of years coming into play. Anyway, so if that's helpful, I think a lot of times it's like don't work so hard to sort of like say here's the next big thing, but take more time to look within yourself and be like, what are the things that for me as a human in my particular situation, whether that's your country or you're a husband or a wife, or you're gay or you're Jewish, or whatever it is that makes you you, and see sort of a sense of what are other people who may be dealing with the same stuff I am, what are they thinking about, and again, where are there now connections in technology, other things where you sort of put together 5 or 6 or 8 or 9 different things and you figure out how they're related. That then is usually for me where I see more long-term trends and predictions.
Now, I've seen you at the forefront of augmented reality and social media, and you were passionate about that, but the last couple of years I see changed man. You work now with ethics, you work with well-being, you work with doing things right, and that seems to be a can I call it a deeper and profounder passion than the other ones? What makes the difference this time for you?
Well, I appreciate the observation. I think that's true. I mean, like augmented reality, social media, I'm a geek, right? So I love technology. So any sort of geekish stuff, I always love. Augmented reality, I knew early on, I was like, this is going to be sort of an internet level disruptor, because it's going to be, information over our eyes, like a phone over our eyes. It's sort of a new iPhone just for our consciousness. I think the deeper thing is, I never knew about ethics, or I never studied it in college. And also I know I have to be careful. I always talk about values pretty quickly, because especially in the corporate realm, the word ethics usually means compliance, which is not just necessarily like, oh, I think, like boring. It's also can be about risk. Whereas really, the work I get to do now in IEEE, the reason it's so deep, to your point, and why I'm so excited about it is, I was just telling Danny before we started the interview, we have this wonderful woman who's working in Tokyo to do a lot of workshops about the work we've created. Here, quick pitch, ethically aligned design. This is the work Danny's been involved with too, the version 2 of this document, and she's working in Japan with all these thought leaders there. So in Japan, for instance, it's not universal, not everyone believes it, but there's something called the Shinto tradition. And Shinto, or animism, is the belief, I'll probably say this wrong, but basically that objects can be imbued with a form of life if they are made, as well as if they are natural, meaning from the environment. So for instance, in Japan, they have this thing called the broken needle ceremony, which apparently once a year, mainly women of the house, will take the needles that they've broken while sewing things and have a sort of a ritual for it as a thank you for not just the object itself, but the spirit of how it's helped the family. And I'm just starting to learn about more Eastern traditions, Confucianism, also things like Ubuntu ethics. And why the work to me is so profound is these questions related to what do we want to do with, say, artificial intelligence. A lot of the conferences I go to pretty much start with the technology, and then the ethics is sort of kind of like scraping the surface, and it's more about like law and policy, which is very important. But the tougher questions really, for me, are about introspection, and a lot of times would come from, I say faith-based traditions, meaning not just religion for religiosity's sake. Like I go to that building, it happens to be Catholic. I go to that building, it happens to be a shrine. But more these ancient questions that really you can't just sort of skirt the issue and say like, hey, do you believe in God? You don't have to think on that question, but if you actually are going to ponder that and wonder even, what is God? Is it a construct? But all those things meaning based on your actual life, based on your culture and your experience and your values. Answering those questions is about you, your values and your subjective truth. Right now, today in 2018, one of the main things we're at the greatest risk of losing, not just with things like what the media calls fake news, but and somewhat pejorative, but meaning that question of how are we getting that information, is also simply the ability to state your truth. Once we get into augmented and virtual reality and we're immersed in those environments, and we won't really have a choice, right? Meaning augmented reality, Danny and I are going to get a meal after we finish this interview. Well, in 5 years, 10 years, to me it's semantics. It's just when, it's not if. We'll have augmented contact lenses, and so will other people. So data about us will sort of float around us as we walk around. Right now, certainly in the States, we have no control over that, none. So our identity, our ability to state our truth it's not hyperbolic. It's already at grave risk. And the GDPR is a wonderful possibility. Estonia is doing some great work in this space too. But all that to say, why I think it's a lot deeper work for me at this time is these questions of applied ethics or values, if you really want to answer them truthfully, it's about saying what are these age-old questions, and you can't soundbite your way around certain issues, like where do we go when we die? Is it wrong to kill a person based on this specific context? It's okay if you put a matrix on the board and talk about something, but if you aren't individually taking a step back and actually saying, my truth is this answer about this, and then think about how you would then build that into an algorithm and put it into a machine, then any other choice is a shortcut. And the last thing I'll say on this is most of the shortcuts that we're making are also deeply informed by the economic structure of how we've lived since the late 1940s. And Danny knows this, but I talk often about the Beyond GDP movement, or gross domestic product. GDP, it's not that it's evil, right? It's not about corporate people are evil using GDP. GDP is a societal tool that was adopted in the 1940s based on a tool created by a guy named Simon Kuznets, who said, don't use this as a measure of economic prosperity. And we did. It's built to measure productivity, right? But something that's built to measure productivity means that, first of all, and Danny knows this too, I hate the word consumer about people. Because productivity means I have to be doing something to even be measured or seen, right? I have to make a product or a service. Well, what about when you're with your family? What about nature? What if, if nature's not producing, water, you're not the water company getting the water from, right? These are things that literally aren't measured in GDP. So unless you're thinking beyond GDP with what's called triple bottom line metrics, in Harvard and other places, people like Michael Porter talk about shared value. You can be sustainable as a business and smart. Companies like Danone, for instance, or the B Corp movement. Sustainability is not just about being green for green's sake. It's about saying, if we actually want to survive as a species, exponential growth, where we're mainly about maximizing shareholder profits, is not going to sustain the human species. That's it. Like, we can argue and talk about, greenhouse gases are fake and global warming is fake, but not from the scientific data I see. And that's the environment. And then the society, that's the other, right? People, planet, profit. Profit, GDP, is a pretty good measure for financial and productivity issues. It's not very good, but it's okay. But sustainability for the environment, if we're not measuring it, we're already at crisis points. Things like South Africa not having water and stuff, like, what else do you want to call that? And then the biggest societal, or at least one of the biggest societal issues I see, is depression and suicide, where there's a lot of great AI and other tools that are being used to help with those things, which are great. But when the answer comes back that technology is the answer, my first response is, well, it's not working. Because according to the CDC and the World Health Organization, right now today, suicide global number 3 cause of death for teenagers, 2018, that's not down the road. And by 2030, it'll be, I think it's the first or second leading cause of global disease, maybe after coronary heart disease. The point being that the world, the planet, from a sustainability standpoint, greenhouse gas emissions, there's no science I know of that says things are getting better, right? Maybe here and there, but overarchingly, the world, the environment is now, it's finite. We have to protect it. Same thing with something like depression and suicide. I bring this up a lot at conferences because I say, if you aren't looking at things like mental health, and this is for companies, for governments, for society, right? It's not about picking on a company, right? But unless companies are able to shift away from that quarterly model for shareholders, where the main priority is shareholder profit, everything is being built de facto with the underlying paradigm of exponential growth, period. That's just a fact. Like, people can say that's not true. It's not. I'm not saying that companies are not trying to do good for their customers and the environment or whatever. But when the door closes, and I know this, Danny and I was in PR, at the end of every quarter, the decisions that are made are prioritized based on the number one thing. We have to maximize shareholder value or profit, the day.
But is it not shifting? Because you're absolutely right. But you mentioned the non already, and Coca-Cola is slowly shifting as well, especially in Europe. I mean, it's not about Coke Red anymore. It's more about non-sugar, and you see quite a lot of other big players, and I leave in the middle if it's out of necessity or out of true value and enlightenment. But you see quite a lot of these big corporations shifting towards what I would call more value-based communication, more ethical thoughts and their way of doing business. I mean, the response of a couple of big American institutions and companies on, for instance, Trump's Muslim ban has been applauded in Europe, because for the first time I think brands couldn't be Switzerland anymore and be neutral. They had to take a step. I mean, if you're Starbucks, you have to make a step. Is this something that's momentary and that's linked to your called current president, or is it something that you see a new stream in the making and an answer to that two big problems you said, which is planet is going apeshit and so are the mental health of the coming generations?
Well, first of all, I applaud all those efforts, meaning where it's not greenwashing and a company is like, hey, I'm going to do something ethical and take a picture. That's fantastic. So any little bit or big bit helps. The irony of, and I don't want to name names of companies, but what's tough is when you are a large organization or multinational corporation and you make a certain product, and then because of your supply chain or the resources needed to make it, when the majority of your product, of what you make, for instance, and again, I speak here in the States, obesity, it's global, but certainly in the States, obesity now, diabetes, I'm overweight, for instance, I'm not trying to be hypocritical, is almost, I think it's at epidemic levels. So, I'm shrugging like this because where a company wants to do good and people want to do good, great, I applaud that. It's not that means nothing, because great, but someone's intention or hopes or things they're doing, even if they're pretty big efforts, again, awesome. But where I want to help, if that's the right word to say, businesses especially, is it's not fair, right? To say to a corporation, hey corporation, you should be focused more like in automation and AI, for instance. You should really make sure to give people jobs as we move forward. But then when the door closes in the end of the quarter, I can name, the legal industry, the automotive industry, the medical industry, any number of industries where there's nobody saying, let's be crystal clear about some things with AI and automation. And this is not anti-AI. Again, always remember, I'm going to go back to the bedrock of societal value. What are the key performance indicators from what society says we want? We may say, yes, we want to eradicate poverty, etc. The UN SDG goals are great. But again, if at the end of the quarter, a business still makes decisions on exponential growth, it's not that I think I'm not saying that they're liars. I'm just saying that what is it that businesses and countries point to? Companies say our numbers go up. Countries say GDP is going up. It's a proxy for prosperity. Whereas a majority of the world's leading economists, Joseph Stiglitz and Amartya Sen, ever since the Stiglitz Commission in 2009, point out that the GDP going up in pretty much any country on the planet, unless there's an aberration, like the 2008 economic stuff that happened here, which made things worse, but when the GDP goes up, it helps a very, very small fraction of typically very, very wealthy people in any area. So it's not a universal, holistic sign of prosperity, period. So I think the thing we have to remember for countries and for governments is if it's not fair to them to say, you should be thinking about these things, then what do we need to change? This is what I've been saying for the past 4 or 5 years, and people, think fundamentally, sometimes they think I'm an idiot, sometimes I'll hear the term socialist, other times I'll hear, well, that's really hard. Okay, you have to look into the history of GDP. It was created by this guy Simon Kuznets when FDR in the Second World War said basically, hey, I need help counting tanks. And this is not to be rude to FDR, right? There was a war happening. FDR said, we're sending so many soldiers and resources to Europe. Can we make sure that our citizens in America survive? He was a good leader. It was FDR. Kuznets created a statistical formula to sort of make sure that both economies could run. And what happened is the soldiers came back, both economies had worked, and then economists became rock stars because no one had been counting stuff in that way. But then there was a very seminal meeting called the Bretton Woods Conference. Again, I forget, late 40s, happened here in the States. The World Bank was born, the IMF was born, the US dollar was agreed as the global currency. And out of 190 whatever countries, 150 came and agreed on what was sort of the foundation of GDP or GNP to say this is what we're going to use to measure. Does everyone agree? And that became literally a universal metric of value for the planet. And today, still in 2018, people think when the GDP goes up, automatically everything's great. That is factually incorrect.
Because it's only economics.
Well, it's economics, and also you have to study why it's going up and where. But in general, again, it's only helping a small portion. It's not holistic. It's not spreading out to whoever. And again, back to, if you're measuring, I don't know, if you're thinking about your health, right? And let's say you have one app, and that one app measures your weight. Great, right? You want to run, I've got a Fitbit, whatever, that's focused on weight. Is that the only app that's going to get you to better health? Like, what if your sleep sucks? What if you drink or smoke, right? Meaning, if you're only focused on one metric and one thing to measure, that's all you're going to see. Okay, so the GDP, here's a couple of things. Doesn't have what's called double entry bookkeeping. Boring, I know, but what that means is when an oil tanker crashes into the side of a country and oil destroys an entire ecosystem, the GDP goes up for that year in the country because there's jobs. But it doesn't measure, right? The double entry means the other side of the coin is, okay, that happened, you have jobs that year, but for the next 9 years, what about the fact that you have to pay to have, now there'll be jobs, but I'm talking about the actual money to get rid of that oil, or the fact that you've decimated the fishing industry, right? It doesn't measure it. It's not there. The reason I get passionate about this is I'm not an economist. I didn't study this in college. But here's another thing it doesn't measure. And remember when the Bretton Woods Conference happened, right? The late 40s. Women, at that time, were not valued. They still aren't globally, but that time, especially in the States, they weren't valued as, equal wages and all that. So guess what the GDP doesn't measure? It doesn't measure caregiving, meaning a parent, whoever in a couple, partner stays at home with their child. GDP, nothing. Doesn't exist.
Scandinavia, they're trying to work on that, right?
Scandinavia, Iceland, by the way, God bless Iceland, they just made women, it's illegal to not pay women the same as men, right? But a lot of times people are like, I wonder why women's issues, and I'm a guy, so I want to be sensitive to, I can't speak from a female's experience, but the actual GDP itself, a caregiver, I raised my son for a couple of years at home, so I was a caregiver even though I was male. But the majority of people in 2018 who still take care of kids and do education around the world, mainly raising kids, is women. And the GDP doesn't see them. So why are they treated with not as much worth? Because they are worth less. Like, I don't know how to hammer that home anymore. And I'll say that and people will be like, that's not a problem. What do you mean it's not a problem? Why are women not paid the same? Because, and then if they get pregnant, and I'm mainly speaking about the States, right, there's this detriment aspect. If you are a couple, male, male, female, female, male, female, any of those combinations, and you want to have one of the two of your partners stay home with your child, GDP won't recognize it. If you pay to have a babysitter or a doula or whatever, that is registered by the GDP. So the GDP rewards behavior, and by the way, I'm not saying any couple's decision about raising their child, that's up to them. They may have a wonderful doula, that's great. My point is that there is also this idea that maybe a lot of people think, and there is research on this, having one of the two parents raise your child is probably what most people want to do because that's why they had kids or they adopted, is to be a part of that experience. The GDP means where it's not recognized. And in a lot of places in Europe, to Danny's point, the Scandinavian countries are amazing about this. It does recognize it. But if you don't recognize it, then that means your entire adult life may be spent in misery if you're the parent who's desperate to be home with your kid and both of you as partners can't be because you have to work hard. You are satisfying a metric. That's it. The society has said this is not worth measuring. Versus if it did, and there was a tax break or whatever else. So the GDP thing, I'm so excited in the past couple of years. I've spoken about this for about 5 or 6 years. It's the past couple of years now, The Guardian, all these different places, this message is coming back. And what that means, by the way, for businesses, my dream is a CEO can go into her shareholders. The door closes at the end of every quarter. And they will ask, how are we doing fiscally? And she'll have to present her numbers like she's doing now. But then they'll ask, how are we doing environmentally? And she'll say, well, we hit our numbers. Here's what we did with green gas emissions. It's not just going to be CSR off in the corner or greenwashing. It's going to be you are responsible CEO for those numbers. And the third, societally, how are we doing on, this in terms of mental health, this in terms of whatever else. All those things. If those three things are equally, and for instance, maybe a company gets fined, maybe they get tax breaks, carrot and stick, I don't care. If the triple bottom line doesn't happen, that is where we are completely screwed. It's not about killer robots. That is the answer. We need to change.
Last question, because you mentioned robots, and we haven't been talking about robots yet. Bots are people are dead afraid of bots, and the cuter, human-like they look like, the scarier they become. Bots, automated systems, should we be scared about them, and how do you see our future as a species together? Are they enhancing us, replacing us? Are they going to kill us?
Sure. Well, robotic systems we've lived with for ages, and the shell around, whether it's simple artificial intelligence or more advanced machine learning or whatever else, to your question, it's the morphology, right? Meaning, what does the skin or the shell around the system look like? So Alexa, people don't really call it a robot, right? But it's a pretty advanced, for what it is right now, system in our home. Same thing with Nest. They just don't look like a face, right? Then you kind of up the sort of morphology to something like Pepper, the robot, where a lot of these robots are designed, or Jibo, to be sort of cute little almost R2-D2 kind of devices. I'm more comfortable with them in the next level I'll talk about, which is, these are designed to be cute, but they are not designed in one sense to trick. And I'm not saying that people are designing robots to trick humans. And a must-read book by Sherry Turkle called Alone Together, She Is a Term I Love, which she says, in terms of people falling in love with robotic devices, we're ready for the romance, which means you can't control, a Jibo comes in your office and you might be like, I hate robots, they're never gonna, and they start, making noises and chirping and helping you out, and you start to form an emotional connection with them. That's called anthropomorphism. We do it with our cars today. Danny's a gearhead. I love that about him. I have that with my guitar. I play, I've had the same acoustic guitar for 30 years. If something happened to it, I'd be devastated. It's imbued with an emotional, certainly tie with me, but, a consciousness between the two of us where I know it's not a person, but it's an object that's sacred, right? So the next level up, though, is like robots like Sophia or robots that are designed to have a human morphology. Now, where these are created for things like, and Sophia, I believe, is this, in certain situations, to be caregivers to seniors or to, help returning veterans from wars. There's a lot of great research being done showing that these devices that look like people can really help people. Where anyone's helped, I want to be clear again, that's fantastic. The risk, however, is there's a term called robotic nudging, which is a field where, in the same way that you can have a friend, call you up for AA, for Alcoholics Anonymous. If you struggle with alcoholism, and you have a friend that can call and sort of nudge and remind you, hey, don't go near a bar tonight, right? That's a good nudging. The negative nudging is typically in the commercial world about advertising. You're trying to trick people, like if a robot went to someone's home, maybe an older person, nudging like, hey, maybe you want to, insert product or service name here, where the logic is they may have dementia, so they spend their money on something they wouldn't have otherwise. But what this all really speaks to, right, because I can't make a choice for someone, or I wouldn't, about their values. Meaning if you decide to have a robot in your house that looks either like an Alexa, like a Pepper, or like a person, based on your and your family's choices, that's your choice. The big issue right now, however, are things like consent, Alexa, all that, etc., is in our home accessing data in ways that most people don't really understand. And you sign a terms and conditions agreement where really any terms and conditions agreement, even though it's legal in one sense, very real sense, and I'm speaking for myself, not for IEEE or anyone else I've ever worked for, it's not moral. Meaning you can say, well, it's a legal binding agreement. Of course it's moral, but my answer is, if you're kind of forcing someone to sign something, Doc Searles calls this a contract of adhesion. It's not trust-based. My way or the highway. You want to be on Facebook, you sign this terms and conditions. Oh, by the way, the new facial recognition was also launched as an opt-out only tool, right? Even though they went to Washington, D.C. and got grilled by Al Franken back in 2009 or whatever, when facial recognition first came out with the boxes around our face, the past 6 months, the new facial recognition, and they got in trouble with it in D.C., the new facial recognition is still opt-out. What does that mean? And I don't mean to pick on Facebook per se, but the status quo of any service is you sign these terms and conditions or else you don't get to use the service, which seems reasonable, but with something like Google or Facebook, or especially once we walk around in the government and there's tools that are surveilling us at all times, if the answer is sign this or don't, what does that eventually mean? Like, what if we spend our entire days inside Facebook virtual reality? Is the answer to citizens, you only do this without any sort of trust-based knowledge of what we're doing? Or the opportunity to say, your privacy and terms and conditions, I understand these legal things you have to do. Here are my terms and conditions. Can we come to some kind of an agreement, right? Anyway, all that to say, back to robots, the reason we don't trust robots is because this stuff, the consent, is cloudy and murky. We don't know how our data
So it is because we don't trust ourselves?
Yes and no. I think one thing, and I'm speaking more about the States, and let's have good news where GDPR is going to help. The GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation from the EU, is this transformational legal precedent where if someone is given that option to say, here's this robot, here's this AI system, Danny, John, whoever, here's how your data is going to be exchanged. But legally, they can't do X, Y, and Z with your data, they being the manufacturers, without letting you know about X, Y, and Z. What that means is consent now becomes, the term I use is data symmetry, right? There's a symmetry, meaning a parity or an equality in a relationship, where instead of it sort of being like your hand is forced to sign something and your data just spills forth from you, hemorrhaging to whoever wants it, because that's where we are now, period, end game. Anybody can track any of my data in the states they want. It's an utter commodity. My identity, who the hell knows where it is? I don't control it. Not at all, none. And if people are like, well, I'm not on Facebook, you are living, get out of that mindset, privacy is dead. That is absolutely not true. People make trillions of dollars off of it, especially third-party data brokers. We have been told this, but now is the time to say, and I'm speaking just for John here, not anyone else, and also want to be clear, I'm not interested in demonizing any one company, but I do want to be crystal clear and say it's line in the sand time in 2018. We have about 5, 6 years, 10 max, before we go into augmented and virtual reality. We have a binary choice. We either go the way of Estonia, of this wonderful progressive place, they own their own data. When someone accesses their medical data, they get like a text, hey, can we take your data? There's a symmetry that builds trust. Doesn't mean that people are breaking the law. Doesn't mean that there's less interaction with brands. It actually means there's more. There's deeper, more robust for brands. And brands can save a ton of money. I used to work in PR, right? So CPAs have been dying for years, right? The cost per thousands of ads have been decreasing for a decade. I knew that back when I worked at Porter. The cost of acquisition to get a client, to stalk them on Facebook is really high. Versus in Estonia, these other models of peer-to-peer, like blockchain type data exchange. It's a handshake. This is all Doc Searles, right? The intention economy. Hey, Danny, I'm a brand. You've used this before. Oh, cool. And Danny, if you want to interact with us, here's our terms and conditions. And Danny goes, okay, well, here are mine. That happens algorithmically in an instant. So the brand knows Danny likes this based on his values, but not this. So guess what a smart brand does? They focus on over here what he wants. And once they prove that handshake trust, or it's sort of forced on them by a blockchain ledger type of situation, either way, when Danny then says, here's the data that you need for me to buy this, then if I say, well, you might also like this, my guess is Danny's going to go, cool, thank you. Personalization in that context means you know what I might like. And Danny would probably say, in terms of shoes, I'll give you all the data you want. Here are the shoes I've worn the last, because you're not asking for my entire contact database or my sex life or my medical data. You're asking me about my shoes. He'll give you more granular data and the cost of acquisition for brands down, the trust up. So all that to say, long answer except to say that robots are a physical manifestation of the main issues we need to deal with as a species today. Consent, with regards to how trust is built, and that also has to do with like the European, the GDPR idea of right to an explanation, because a right to an explanation also means if someone says, hey, this robot just did something I don't understand, the robot manufacturers should be able to say, built on algorithms, what are they actually asking they're concerned about? How do we respond back to them in human speak so we make them feel comfortable and build trust? It's really hard for manufacturers. That's incredibly complex. But what else do you want me to say? Like, build a car without a seatbelt because it'd be easier. Okay. We're in these times where you're going to build trust or not. And the last thing I'll say about Sophia, it's a long discussion, but this term robotic personhood is a really complex one. Legally, the idea of corporate personhood has been around for decades, where a corporation has a form of personhood, but I'm using air quotes because personhood means they're attributed certain legal aspects. Right now in the media, robots like Sophia, especially when those manufacturers are really kind of milking the
She's
PR.
a legal citizen of Saudi Arabia.
Exactly, and now I'm sorry, it, because it's not a she. Technically, it's not. The United Nations, certain parts of it are helping in that device's desire to be an ambassador for human rights, which is so very confusing. And again, I want to be clear here. It's not that I think that device couldn't be a really good ambassador for human rights in the sense of teaching people about what a robot is, teaching people about systems, how humans and robots can and should work together synergistically, because I very much believe in that. But in the same way that I wouldn't want people to, beat on robots or destroy them or something, it is okay to say we're humans and robots, at least for today, are different. And right now today, the humans that are refugees who don't have citizenship, that should be dealt with first before we start giving machines a similar type of structure that confuses the masses. They don't know about all the legal nuances. They just see that device really looks cool. Wow, the animatronics are very impressive. There's some basic AI, which is also interesting. But they are calling it she, and they are saying that she is a citizen. So based on where you live in the world, how does that make you feel as a human when you feel your rights are being transgressed in certain ways? Well, the answer is your rights are already becoming less valued than what some people are saying other devices should be in terms of those rights. And where I get really confused is the intellectual property. When there's something like Sophia, and I wrote this in my book, again, this is all me, not IEEE, I want to be clear about that. When there's a device that you sort of want to say, I believe this device is sentient, right? And I'm not trying to minimize that, meaning if someone believes that a device is real, I'm not going to call them a liar. They believe that. But where I get massively confused is where they would say, well, Sophia is real. She is a citizen, right? Well, most people would say, well, can you own a citizen? Because if you own the intellectual property to Sophia or that device or the hardware.
Wasn't that called slavery in old times?
That's what it is. It's pretty simple to me. And that to me means I would have much more respect, or at least clarity, if someone said, okay, this device, I believe she is a citizen. And any country that said, agreed, she has citizenship, if they said, based on our belief system, like a Japanese sort of Shinto tradition, that device is, I would have, it might take some adjustment, but I would understand, because if they also then said, this particular device or this line of devices, we won't be making money off of it. We are helping kind of foster it, but sort of, and if they use terms like adoption or whatever else, would it maybe weird me out for a while? Sure, I'd have to adjust to it. But I would understand it, because their logic is, we believe that this device is now sentient, and we are sort of across this line, A to B.
It is and that's the last thing, and then we're going to eat.
Yeah.
is
talking a lot.
Is that notion of our devices becoming sentient or not? Is that going to be the same? I'm not saying in the same 2 years, because we clearly know at this moment they're not, but it can become. But if you look at the 1800, I'm from Belgium, we had a notorious king with some awful stuff in Africa, because the Catholic Church said these are inferior beings and they have no soul. Are we now at the same spot where we say, well, these are inferior beings because they're not sentient?
No, I think we're at the opposite. I think we're at a very clear point where, in multiple ways, humans are defined as inferior. The media right now, typically, and I don't mean to demonize per se, but the narrative
There's more
of
coverage on Sophia than on the refugees.
Oh, hands down. And by the way, I get it. It's a fascinating device. It's a touchstone of all this conversation. Refugees are very difficult, complex, not like an up discussion, but no, more like any time, or the most of the time you read about automation, the title, not even link bait, but the titles are always about us versus them. DeepMind beats chess after 4 hours of going from A to Z.
And we're always losing.
We're always losing, but the sort of reminder, I hope that people, watch your stuff. I don't know how many followers you have. Ask yourself, why is that always the positioning? Because deep down we've been trained since the GDP was created to assume that productivity and speed wins. Innovation is always about, well, this chess game now beats a human. Well, that means that
But
thing.
it cannot comfort a child.
Well, but see, the thing about comforting a child, what I'm trying to point out here is, if we keep positioning machines as and humans, us versus them, can a machine comfort a child today? Yeah, it can. That's not up to me. Meaning, if a person feels comforted, that's their situation. It's like a teddy bear, right? But that's not my issue. My issue is society needs to move away from this us versus them. Or what that means is, first of all, is Sophia given rights where refugees or women aren't, right? Then that automatically means that in that example, refugees or women will probably feel less than. They'll start to feel worthless. Ask jobs over and over and over again. Skills are automated. Sorry, it's not a message of like, yay humans, look at this whole new sector that's been automated. And it's rhetoric when people come back and say like, well, it just means there'll be new types of jobs. And like, come on. Now here's me, I'm in the United States. Danny may show this in Europe. No. I'm 49 tomorrow, it's my birthday. If I lose this job, maybe there'll be a lot of great online sites where I can learn certain skills or whatever else. There is nobody who's going to be like, ring, hey John, here's a new job for you to match your skills. Here's how you can reskill yourself. Like, we have to get beyond, pardon the language, the total bullshit that is such a part of all these conversations about automation. In the States, will people be given money to pay them while they go from one job to the other? No, absolutely not. Except the top tier that has a severance package. I was an actor in this city for 20 years, right? I lose a job, that's it. Savings gone in a couple of weeks. The gig economy, yay, the gig economy. If you don't have medical insurance and you don't know how your kids are going to pay for college, every medical bill, you live in terror. Abject terror. Period. So yeah, oh, John's seeming kind of excited and hyperbolic. I have no more time for bullshit. None. When the planet is at the point where Cape Town doesn't have water. Like, what the hell else do we need? The green, gas emissions in the videos of icebergs melting maybe seems a little ethereal. People are lining up to get water from restaurants in Cape Town to
Victoria.
Make their toilets work. Like, I'm sorry, one place on the planet losing water, that's pretty systemic. And then here's the other thing, not to end on a morbid note, I'll make it positive before I stop talking and we go eat. I'm a dad. The third leading cause of death for young people on the planet is suicide. Now, you got to take that in context, car accidents, whatever else. But my point is that how people die, from a disease where it's cancer, whatever else, is not self-inflicted. It doesn't come from depression. And the thing that's so detrimental about depression, why it's often compared to hunger, it's not that hunger and depression are the same things. And I'm not trying to say that people suffering from hunger have the same type of suffering. What I'm saying is how it's similar is that, say you get a heart attack and die, it's relatively finite, the suffering. Depression lasts months, years, affects every part of your relationships. That is human. Now, you know what robots don't have, as far as I know? Sophia or any other ones? Depression. Might be bad code, but it's not the malaise that is a pandemic, according to the World Health Organization. And if we as a society are not going to move beyond a metric, back to GDP, created in the 1940s. When we're talking about Sophia being a citizen, and this device might be, it might become conscious. Okay, cool. Can we also update the metric that, along with whatever else, means, because we're focusing on this stuff over here and not seeing the suffering? Today, right now in 2018, depression and suicide are at such incredible high levels, and they're going up. Is that AI's fault? Of course not. Is it society's fault? It is, in terms of what we want to measure. Can we change it? Yes, we can. But companies and governments are the main ones that are going to have to go, hold on. Are we going to actually take a step back? And it's not just about profits and we're evil, but you have kids. I have kids. Anyone who doesn't have, enough money to pay whatever, or you have a 401k, we all have kids. Your kids, whoever you are watching this video, rich, poor, wherever you are on the planet, the number 3 leading cause of death for all of our kids is suicide based on depression. So what do we do? And I got news for you. You could say, a corporation watching this, well, it's not my problem. Of course it is. Of course it is. So robots and AI, let's put them over here for a second. The opportunity, widen the lens, triple bottom line. The environment, how do we keep people from not being out of water? How do we keep green gas emissions from making sure we can breathe air? Secondly, societally, how do we say, okay, depression, for instance, is one of the main things that's actually taking people off the planet. If you want to be grotesque, you have a business, you're selling to less and less people if they literally aren't there. Isn't that morbid to think about? Yeah, but I'm more interested in thinking about that very real issue pandemic today than when AGI might arrive. It's a cool topic to talk about. Should it be prioritized? No.
Great. Thanks, man.